All right, what up, everybody? You are listening to the Ferment podcast. I am your host, Adam Russell, and today my friend Casey Corum is here with me. What up, Casey?
What up?
Where are we at right now?
We are we're in Vineyard of Harvest,
Yes.
which is in Walnut, California. It's a church up here in it's kind of the north of LA, north of Orange County. Just LA County kind of peaks over the top.
Yeah.
And we are in the beginnings of what's going to be called Brea Canyon recording. So,
Yeah, that's what I was really getting at is that this is about to be like your new space.
That's right. That's right. Super pumped. We're it's good enough to do video.
No, that's right.
Shoot
That's
this video.
what
We got some more work to do, but we're very, very close.
Yeah. What I was telling some of the guys earlier is I'm hoping that we can do some more creative stuff here, and this is like the beginning of maybe kind of a little footprint of things to come.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, here's what's in my brain anyway. You and I, we've had another podcast together.
That's right.
But it was more, we were talking about just some vineyard value
That's
stuff.
right.
The 4 H's of a vineyard worship leader or a kingdom worship leader. And it occurred to me after texting with you a little bit that we've never really captured your story on this podcast. So I thought, my goodness, well, we just need to do this, right?
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
So here's what I'd love to do. I'd love to start with you the way we do everybody. Can you just tell us, like, how did you grow up and where are you from? Because I think of Casey as California.
Yeah.
But
right.
I know that maybe that's not exactly where it started.
Well, I think one of the things I tend to say is I'm kind of from nowhere.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Well, I moved around a lot. So I was born in Texas, strangely enough. I went back there later, but my dad was in the Army, Vietnam era. Lived overseas for the first year of my life outside of Istanbul, Turkey. So that's another piece of my story. I have no conscious memory of that, but that's part of it. My parents were born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, Washington State in particular. And that's basically where I grew up, although we moved around a lot in the state of Washington. First 3 years of school were in three different areas. We eventually landed in kind of the valley where my parents grew up, called the Okanagan Valley. It's actually the American side of where David Roos lives these days. So
that's right. So you have really Pacific Northwest vibes.
I do. Although the Pacific Northwest is its own thing for sure, but it's certainly like I usually say I'm from the West Coast because I moved to California between my freshman and sophomore year of high school. So that led us down to LA County. And that's kind of cemented us in California for lots of reasons. I'm sure we'll get into some of that in a second,
absolutely. Well, but I guess I'm also interested, like I am with so many of our guests, like what kind of family were you guys? Were y'all a family of faith, or were you kind of like non-practicing Christians? Like what happened at home?
Right. Well, I didn't grow up in any sort of faith. My parents are classic baby boomers in that they grew up in the church. And again, this is maybe a West Coast thing. They grew up in the church and hit the 60s and kind of did their own thing. You know, kind of followed the Beatles. And my parents will listen to this. My mom will obsessively listen to this, so she's going to redirect my storytelling probably at some point. But
that's right.
She, they got married young. Again, it was the 60s, Vietnam. My dad got drafted, and the faith of their childhood was being called into question, culturally speaking, and I guess that just sort of got jettisoned like a lot of the culture. So
were they hippies?
They were borderline hippies. Yeah. I mean, the Army thing.
You said follow the Beatles.
I had an uncle that kind of did. Went to India and the whole.
No way.
Yes.
Yeah, man, the 60s. What a time.
Yeah, they did their thing. My dad got drafted and he was married. So I think that kind of softened some of that pursuit. But my dad was a conscientious objector, so that also factors into my family story as well. So
and that fits the hippie vibe as well.
It does, yes.
Yeah.
So he was a medic. He was a medic. That's why we ended up in Turkey rather than, who knows where he would have ended up, but that was part of it. So yeah.
Amazing.
I would say my parents were finding their way as a young married couple. I would say, the 60s were and early 70s were, spiritually adventurous, and in their own way, I think they were pretty open. But so I grew up in a pretty open, hippie style, do what you love sort of environment.
So when did you come to faith, or when did you come to the Vineyard?
Well, we moved to Southern California, which is, big disruption. I lived in kind of rural Washington State. So small town of about 1,000 people. My high school, Palmdale High School, had 3,000 kids at the time. So my high school had 3 times as many people as my town did.
Yeah.
So that was, I mean, both of my parents are musicians. I grew up with a lot of music in my life. So it was kind of MTV era. So it was a culture shock, but it wasn't maybe quite the culture shock it might have been in a previous generation. But I moved from a very white bread, rural Washington State, bordering some Native American reservations. So there's some of that was part of my story, but yeah, to this super diverse, I'll call it urban, although Palmdale's on the outskirts of LA County. For those who know, it's its own place at some level, and it's still kind of a rough place.
Yeah.
So yeah, as happens when you make a big transition like that, lots of things go into play. So, spiritually speaking, I met a girl in choir who eventually invited me to. Well, we were dabbling in some sort of a relationship, and that led to for her a crisis of faith. She said, we can't explore this relationship, and I'm a Christian, you're not, and I'm like, I don't. For me, my background of faith with Christian faith would have been like popular media and maybe my grandmother. That would have been the context I would have had for. Maybe I touched base with a youth group like an occasional meeting. But yeah, she invited me to the Desert Vineyard on a Tuesday night. They had a youth church meeting that was basically, the Vineyard does this classically in the sense that, the ball moves around for youth group meetings, but for the most part, big Vineyard values, everybody gets to play.
Yeah.
So this youth church meeting it wasn't your typical youth group. This was like full on worship, teaching, ministry time.
And did the kids do all the stuff?
They did. They did.
So
there's some adult. That's right.
It wasn't just like the adults do it for the kids.
That's right.
Yeah. I think that's kind of important.
This was the late '80s, so Vineyard's still pretty young, and kids leading worship and kids. I think they actually had some kids preaching that night, and of course the ministry time as well. For me, as a somebody outside the faith, I walked into this room of kids reaching out to God. I'd say I was outside the faith, but I was not raised in an atheist.
You weren't antagonistic.
There was definitely, I think, especially growing up in the house of musicians, there's always that connection to the other. There's always this idea that you touch something from an artistic perspective that's something that comes from without. So I was certainly open.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all of my intersections with the church, as brief as they were prior to that, they just left me wanting. They left me like, if God is real, that's my basic theology at the time. If God is real, then that's important.
Yeah.
And I guess at the time, again, I was 17, so what kind of developed theology do you have? I guess I hadn't run into a group of Christians that I believed that they believed, really. Again, I wouldn't have been that developed in my thinking at the time, but anyway, I walked into this room filled with young people, and they weren't church young people. They were, we're Vineyard people, right? So they were Vineyard young people. So in the 80s, everybody dressed like the genre of music you listen to. So it's hard to believe now, but I had long hair and multiple earrings, and I had hair.
I think I've seen a picture or two.
Yes, right.
It's almost a mullet. Did you have a mullet?
I had the mullet with the skater in the front. So it's party in the front, party in the back.
Yeah, it's not. It wasn't quite flock of seagulls, but it was
the back. But then it was also simply red would have been the more the vibe I had going, ginger hair and the like.
Yeah.
But yeah, I walked in. Looking back on it now, I know I walked into the tangible presence of God, and people that were hungry and reaching out to God, and I was immediately drawn in. Mm-hmm. And of course, I didn't know what to do with that. Yeah. Eventually, I went to the Desert Vineyard on a Sunday morning, and there was something happening, I think, in the youth of the valley up there, Antelope Valley, because there was a lot of evangelism. There's a lot of kids coming to faith. I was sort of on the front end of that. So eventually somebody started showing me the ropes to share the gospel with all the praying the prayer and all the doing all the things. And apparently that day I was, I came into the whole deal a musician, so apparently I'm legal now. So I prayed the prayer and they immediately asked me to be their drummer.
That's right. So I guess we should just maybe take a step back here and go, where did the music come from? I know you said your parents were musicians.
That's right.
And I know even recently I've seen you post like your dad is playing all these crazy piano pieces.
That's right.
Like your dad, he could play.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I don't know how far it goes back on both sides, but my mom's mom used to play in speakeasies in like the 30s. So she, which is kind of interesting, especially living in rural parts of the country. I didn't grow up with a bent towards the folksy or the country expression of things. It was always more like my grandparents would have been more focused on jazz, for instance. So, which is an interesting little bent. But so yeah, that's the house my mom grew up in. My mom and dad met. They actually met when they were very young, but they grew up playing music together in high school bands and high school choirs, and they grew up in the same town. So. Yeah. My mom eventually became a music educator. So she was, this is a fate I wish on no one, but she was my 8th grade band teacher, second period, and my 9th grade choir teacher. So that's a...
Okay, so you were not just a musician in a musical family, but you were a band kid.
Well, no. I was for a small window, yes.
Okay.
But being a band teacher's son, you are made to do things.
Got it.
Sorry, Mom.
Yeah. There's expectations.
There's expectations.
Yeah. It's like a pastor's kid.
Yeah.
You're drugged through some stuff.
That's
I get
right.
that.
My dad didn't pursue music professionally in any way, but my dad is a incredible pianist in particular. So
it's like I said a minute ago. I've seen some of those clips that you've posted of him playing.
Right.
He's a legit player.
Right. So growing up in that, and of course my parents had an incredible record collection too. So I was surrounded by all kinds of music. My dad, when I was younger, the first memories I have of my dad, like now he's digging into this composer called Rameau, and doing all these crazy videos in his 70s, which is great. It's great. When I was a kid, he was doing a super deep dive into the works of Scott Joplin and ragtime stuff.
Yeah,
I've actually never talked to him about this. I'm assuming that comes out of the movie The Sting, which is an early 70s Robert Redford movie. But my dad was literally learning top to bottom Scott Joplin songs. So I grew up with all this ragtime stuff. But my dad's, always kept that around. Classical, but also kind of doing dives into these, never really pop music. It's always in these kind of obscure lanes. So,
well, since we're talking about music and just growing up in a musical family, and even before we get to the Vineyard stuff, what did you love? Like you said, you said your parents had a great record collection.
Yeah.
Like what moved you?
Well, man, there was music in the house all along. So like my parents had basically every Beatles record. Yeah. I know that's not your favorite. So.
Not my favorite, but that's okay. It's legal.
It's legal. All right. Every Beatles record.
What's your favorite Beatles record?
Well, I'd probably have to say the White Album at this point. But the first two records I discovered were Revolver and, but before that was Magical Mystery Tour, which is, it's an interesting one in the pantheon of Beatles records. But I remember putting on giant headphones and listening to swirling sounds of, it just blew my mind. Just listening to Magical Mystery Tour. Beatles, lots of jazz, everything from older stuff, but it definitely leaned newer, like the kind of newer Miles Davis.
Yeah.
There was also kind of dives into like R&B and funk and soul stuff as well.
Well, I was going to say, where did that come in? Because I know that when I think of you as a musician, I think of Casey being like, you're definitely in that R&B space. That's kind of home base. There's other things, but home base is soul.
Right. Well, Motown, they had,
Yeah.
they equally had, I don't know if they had every Motown record. There's a lot of them, but they had certainly had loads of Motown, pushing into which I guess is technically still Motown, into the early 70s, Stevie Wonder, which is still my favorite Stevie Wonder era. Earth, Wind and Fire,
Yeah.
Jackson's, kind of coming. I think as I'm talking here, it feels Motown driven now that I'm thinking, I'm talking about it out loud. So
Yeah.
but yeah, and there's certainly more to it than that. But those are kind of, even musically speaking, personally, like the Beatles chord structure, the pop melodies, the R&B sensibility, those definitely informed my early years.
Did you learn to play some of those songs?
I did, actually. I always say this is a great tool for parents musician parents who want their kids to take on music, but they don't want to squeeze the music out of them, right? So I think my parents didn't do this on purpose, but what I think they did well in regards to me and I have one sister. My sister's upbringing, musically speaking, is they just had instruments in the house. Had a piano, had a guitar, eventually had a set of drums, eventually had a whole studio, actually.
Yeah.
And then my mom would between figuring some things out by ear, and then she'd buy all these like easy pop piano books, and let me kind of figure out. I learned a lot of pieces of songs, and then I would lose some interest when they got a little difficult. Like I learned intro to this song or that song.
Yeah.
When I was, I don't know how old I was. I must have been 7 or 8 years old. I learned the entire easy piano version of Staying Alive.
That's right.
There's a story from the time my mom was in student teaching at the time at a high school in the area, and I guess my school got out a day early, so I was in the back of the band room, like playing this whole Staying Alive, and some high school kids came back and they were super impressed by it was the 70s, right?
Yeah.
So I remember they said, like, wow, you're like a little Barry Manilow.
That's it.
So it's like a
high praise.
At the time, I guess.
High praise. I don't know. Yeah.
I think I was mildly offended then too. But
that's funny.
Yeah.
Well, I forget where I hear this, but I've heard a couple other people say the same thing. Like, if you want to have kids who play music, just throw some instruments around the house.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
Like, leave them out.
That's right.
And kids will find their way to them.
That's right.
Right. I mean, I guess the even one level up would be reverse psychology. Have the instruments and tell your kids, don't play.
Yeah.
Don't.
I didn't try
whatever
that
you do, don't play them.
Yeah. There you go.
And then your kids are in.
I think there's some wisdom there.
Yeah. Okay. So then you come to the youth group band, or you come to the youth group. You meet Jesus, and they're like, "Well, Casey's a musician.
That's right.
And they want you to play drums.
That's right.
So is that your first moments of stepping into worship?
It is, in terms of actually being on the team.
That's right.
Yeah. So we moved to California. We actually took a whole band with us to California, believe it or not, like a bunch of older kids from like post high school kids that wanted to do an LA thing. So I ended up with this whole studio set up in my house at the time. So I played numerous instruments, and I was trying to pursue this kind of LA studio. I don't know what I was doing. You're 17 years old, and the tracks are way clearer now than what you can do. I know people still get confused, but I just knew I wanted to do the whole thing. One giant musical influence in my life to this day, actually the first record I ever personally owned was Prince's 1999.
Yeah.
So that was sort of my, the center of the bullseye for me. Like, do everything. Prince played everything. Prince sang every voice. Prince,
he wrote the songs. He played the songs. He produced the songs.
Yes.
He lived in the studio.
That's right.
Yeah.
Prolific.
Yeah.
And that was really, I don't know, if I had a goal, I don't know if it's probably too cheesy to say this back then, but that was basically, I wanted to be exactly like Prince. That was sort of my end game. So anyway, I stepped into faith. Two things happened. One is I joined the worship team the day I prayed the prayers, did the thing. Obviously faith is a journey, right? So,
that's right.
But that's, I'm legal at that point.
Yeah.
But at that moment, in that season, the Lord sort of lifted that off of my plate. Said, sort of put it, in hindsight, I know he put it aside, but I thought I was literally giving it up. Even strangely enough, the modern worship world the career path worship leader built itself under my feet. It was not a thing people did.
Yeah.
It was not even like an imagination. It wasn't like, oh, I'll do a Christian thing now. That wasn't.
I'll be
in
a
the,
worship songwriter.
yeah, that was
I'll
not
make
a,
worship records.
yeah,
I'll
back,
be on staff at a
that's right.
church.
None of those
and
things
we'll
were,
tour.
yeah, none of those
Yeah.
things were a thing.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, at the time, we didn't even know where the songs came from at the time. And Vineyard was always writing songs. And this was, by the time I came into the Vineyard in 88, the Vineyard had released records, and the Vineyard had, there's still songs all over the world even by that point. But you wouldn't have known it from the church itself. The songbooks had no names. The songbooks had almost no song titles. You just had like lists of lyrics and chords, and you taught them. You would learn them in the process of small group.
Yeah, it's very word of mouth.
That's
very,
right. That's right.
Like pass it to your friends kind of a thing.
So for me, it was a bit of a death. It was like, well, I'm orienting my life around Jesus now, and I don't know what that means. I just know it doesn't mean serving my own ends. So that started a journey of figuring out what that meant.
Yeah, even when you say that, I'm reminded in the Gospels, like every time Jesus meets the disciples, in particular the 12, his invitation for them to follow him requires that they lose something.
Right.
Like, Matthew, follow me. So he leaves his career.
That's right.
Peter and James and John, like, get out of the boat. You're coming with me. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
Right. So, that was my junior year of high school, and then, which is it's a great and a terrible time to have your whole life flipped around. So I didn't know what I was going to do, and I thought, maybe I'd go. I mean, YWAM was a big thing. I looked into. You get the YWAM Go manual. At the time, it was a paper manual, and you can sort of let your mind dream a little bit, and all over the world.
Hawaii.
Let's
go.
Hawaii. My girlfriend at the time. My girlfriend at the time, I was tortured her with. She just wanted to get married and settle down, and I said, well, what if God calls us to Africa?
Yeah.
And that was the big thing. And she's like, I don't want to go to Africa. We eventually got married, but so
she won.
She won. She did. She won.
There you go. Shout out Angie.
So we actually, through the course of that whole senior year, trying to figure out where we were going together, where we were going separately. We were dating and trying to figure that out on top of all this stuff. We both sort of separately and together ended up on a church planting team, moving to Boise, Idaho.
How old were you when that happened?
We were 18.
So that was really young. I knew you went to Boise, but I had no clue that it was that young.
Yeah, just post high school. We just, there's more to the story, but we up and moved.
Were you leading worship at that time?
I was leading worship. Pretty quickly after joining the main, like the youth worship team. Eventually I started leading that, but the first place I led worship was in a small group. So we'd meet a midweek youth Bible study was the first.
That's the classic Vineyard way, right? You started home group and.
Well, and like we've talked, and our good friend Ted Kim talks about like the importance of leading in that small group setting and the things that you learn in those settings. So yeah, that was definitely my path. So moving to Boise, I was on the worship team. I would lead worship. A lot of, this was a season in the Vineyard where the next generation past the boomers, past the founding generation, I led worship. I played in the band and I led worship for the youth and young adults, but we weren't allowed to do real things quite yet. Even with everybody gets to play. We had our boxes that we lived in.
That's right. Well, I guess I'm always interested in this. When you start leading worship, do you remember the first song that you played?
I remember the first sets of songs we played.
Yeah, like what?
So there's a song, we were talking about this the other day. I don't know if you know this song. There's a song that at the time was super popular called Psalm 9.
Okay.
I will praise, echo, you, O Lord. Yes. Real easy Vineyard song.
Yeah.
And then there's a Sam Phillips song called Strength of My Life. That's another one I remember from those early days.
Well, I guess I have a question about that too, because a lot of the Vineyard songs back in the day would echo. Yeah,
Yeah.
you just want to tell, like, I'm sure there's people who are listening who have no idea what that even is now, because no songs do that.
That's right. That's right. Well, it was kind of a thing. They'd have a male and female parts, and
Yeah.
you'd have call and response. It happened in a lot. More love, more power. That's
It's
a call.
interesting.
It had its little moments.
There were a lot of Vineyard songs that did that. It's just
There
funny
was.
to me that even as I'm sitting here thinking about it now, there are no Vineyard songs that do that now.
Well, right, and people don't even know what to do with them. So,
Yeah.
like, I mean, there's some of those songs that still live. Like, I think of the Prosh Daniels, "Blessed Be the Name of the Lord."
Yeah.
That was a call and response, but nobody does it anymore.
Yeah.
They just sing it. So but that was definitely one of those songs in that male and female part situation.
That is so good.
Songs of their era. But actually, right around that time was when I remember it being sung at church, and it kind of immediately landed in my playlist, and actually stays in my playlist to this day, and that's Holy and Anointed One.
Yeah.
So I remember that being taught in 88, 89.
Would you have even known who John Barnett is at that time?
No.
Yeah.
No. They actually I do know that John Barnett wrote it at the time, because they actually started putting names on chord sheets.
Okay, so there would be the chords and the name.
It was a whole shift in
philosophy.
There wasn't like a rule against it. It was just like, suddenly it was like, oh, these songs come from a person. They didn't come from heaven.
Yeah, they just fell out on Sunday morning, and now we all know them.
That's right.
Yeah. So those are the first maybe hacks of songs.
Those
Psalm
are
9, Holy and Anointed One.
I do remember playing More Love, More Power in the band, because it had you could play power chords with. When I moved to electric, so you could.
Yeah.
You could metalize it.
Did you have any stomp boxes? Or was it just like clean tone, dirty tone?
No, you know what I did have? I had this is a little nerdy. I had a Yamaha multi-effects box called a Rex 50.
Okay, what is that?
It is kind of a precursor to like a Line 6 pod.
Okay.
So it had like 100 presets.
Yeah.
And you could stack effects. And
yeah. Were any of them good?
I mean, the delays and verbs were all right.
Yeah.
I mean, because, Yamaha, but, the overdrives and they made noise. Actually, I don't know if I could take credit for this or not. We had this, there's an old, I don't know where this song comes from, maybe the Catholic Charismatics, Humble Thyself in the Sight of the Lord.
I do not
know that one?
I don't know that song.
Humble Thyself in the Sight of the Lord. So, again, it's the late 80s. And my musical tastes are pretty broad, but I stumbled across a dotted eighth delay setting, and in the 80s, played U2 version of Humble Thyself in the Sight of the Lord. So you're welcome.
There you go. That's your gift.
I brought it into the church.
Yes. You can take it all the way back to Casey Corum.
That's
you heard
right.
it here first,
1988, kids. Lancaster, California.
Well, let me just maybe switch gears slightly, because we're seeing you come into the church, you're beginning to lead worship. Mm-hmm. There's this first pack of songs, but I also think of you as a songwriter. Mm-hmm. So were you immediately writing songs, or was that something that came kind of later? And did you write songs before?
I did. Yeah. So part of my journey into me crossing over into what, like, now I'm like call myself a musician, was 8th grade. Small rewind to say, started hanging around with this group of older guys, like post high school, who were making original music, which in my little town was completely unusual. I mean, they had drums and amps and electric guitars, and they eventually had a Fostex 4-track. They bought a Roland TR 727 drum machine, and they just started making their own music. So I was this was 8th grade. I was just completely in, and I just was that annoying kid just hanging around all the time. And small town being what it is, one of the guitar player up and moved to Seattle, because it's a small town, and what are you doing in this small town when you're 20 years old? You're doing nothing. So so I volunteered to play. I didn't play. I mean, I could kind of fret some things. So they looked at me and they weighed their options in this small town, and they they said yes. So
they accepted you.
Yeah, so they accepted me. So, but it was all original music. There was no covers. So that was sort of an entry into. I mean, originally I was trying to cop this guy's parts and, fit into the band, but that eventually turned into like writing and recording and.
And so when you were writing in that band, is it like team writing?
Well, it's I guess so. Yeah, I guess it's a band thing, and like so many bands, you're like, you don't know what you're doing. So it's a little bit kind of bumping around in the dark and trying to find your way to better music, I guess, and robbing licks from your favorite other songs to kind of turn into something. So yeah, that started with just literally churning through songs on, programming into sequencers and programming drum machines and recording, bouncing tracks on a 4-track until they sound like mostly hiss.
Yeah.
But just sort of finding your zone. That's the band that ended up in LA with us. And so I came into Faith with that creative bent, and like so much early work. I mean, it's all terrible.
Yeah, but it was a start, right?
It was a start.
It was the initiation into whatever that was.
It was, and it was for me, kind of looking forward into other zones in my life. It wasn't just the writing. It was the engineering. It was the production. It was the whole.
You liked all of it.
Yeah, and kind of building tracks from the ground up. So, So, I think the journey into song. Maybe it might have been things like they started to put names on things to realize these songs come from someplace. And I had a very early intersection with Andy Park. So we were invited as part of a series of Vineyard youth conferences in Scandinavia to be the worship band. So my wife Angie and my girlfriend at the time, and our team went with Brent Rue, who was the kind of the Swedish. He was the American married to a Swede who was kind of like the Vineyards guy in doing things in Scandinavia at the time. I think Wimber did too, but Brent kind of led the way due to his kind of connections. So anyway, Langley Vineyard that Andy Park was a part of was part of that initial trip that we went on right after mid '89, and I knew that Andy wrote a song called Warrior. You can look that one up, and I think it was that intersection with Andy.
Is that in the Vineyard catalog?
It is. Yeah.
Warrior.
Deep
cut.
Deep cut. It's like, oh, here, and I didn't really like that song.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, Warrior.
Yeah.
But I think it was catching a clue. I think what was starting to happen with me is the Lord was opening my heart, my spirit, giving me a vision for kind of taking music and that whole thing out of my life, even though I was leading worship. And again, this wasn't a career path at the time, but kind of moving me back into it and realizing like, okay, I've made you a certain way, and this is, we took it away for a while. Now it's, now let's get back to business here. So.
Yeah. And sometimes we just need someone else to show us, oh, this is possible.
Right.
Oh, right. Andy is doing this.
That's right.
Or even just that Langley crew in general, because it wasn't just him.
That's right. So there are two things that happened right after we moved to Idaho. Two I guess you'd call them recordings. One is like a legit indie recording. There was a record that came out of the Langley Vineyard in Vancouver, BC area called Changed by Your Glory. And this was an indie local church record in a time where nobody did that. And I remember at one point I heard some of the backstory. I remember they spent $10,000 on it, which blew my mind.
Yeah. So in 1980 bucks, what is 10 grand?
I mean, it feels astronomical to me.
Is it 50 grand?
It's probably 50 or more. Yeah, I would think. But this record had Faithful One, had I Lift My Eyes Up, had Refiner's Fire, had Good to Me, and more. It had all these.
So talk to me about that, because that's kind of ridiculous.
It is ridiculous.
We're talking maybe 6 or 7 songs that are
worldwide
some of the most important songs in the Vineyard catalog,
That's
and that happens at a place in a moment.
Right. Well, Langley was an interesting place. It was I don't know if it was the first vineyard in Canada, but it became sort of the the mothership of Canada at the time. Gary Best was the pastor, and Andy Park was the first worship pastor there, which again, that's how I intersected with them and kind of in the first place. Andy brought up 2 young songwriters. One of them became the worship pastor, was a young Brian Dirksen.
Yeah.
So 19, I think, at the time, when he took over. And then they had actually made a handful of records prior to that, which I discovered later, and it brought me some probably unsanctified joy to listen back to these terrible early, because it felt like I could see the journey. Like, oh, okay, this didn't just happen out of nothing.
It's never the first.
That's
record,
right.
Like
I actually think that Changed by Your Glory record was the 7th record. If I was an uber nerd at the time of digging into that world. So yeah, they had a value for it. Even like I think Gary Best hired Andy, if memory serves. He actually hired Andy to be the worship pastor prior to himself taking a salary. So that was one of the kind of like hallmarks of like, we value worship so much that I'm gonna hire Andy before I hire myself. So,
man,
and then that kind of bled forward to Brian. Michael Hansen came out of that church. Craig Mousseau, written all kinds of songs, came out of that church. Daphne Rademacher came out of that church. Just tons and tons of, to this day.
And what I love about that story is it's something we even see now. It's like the connection between a senior leader and worship.
Right.
Like when somebody gets it, that's a powerful combination.
That's right.
I'm even thinking of like Wimber and worship, but then even Gary.
That's right.
And this crew of women and men who are writing songs.
That's right.
That's just, it's a part of the Vineyard story. But even now, it's still a part of the story, right?
It
like
is,
you think even like Elevation. You think Stephen Furtick. He writes songs with the people. There's something about that combination that's
right.
important.
Yeah, and I think it's a holding a high value and pouring into it, like, which is everything. It's it's something as tangible as like literal money, paychecks, and $10,000 record budgets, and giving time and energy to it. And it changed the face of the whole world. It certainly changed my life.
Yeah.
One other connected piece is that was right in the moment where the what used to be called the Kansas City Fellowship and the Kansas City Prophets intersected with the Vineyard. Mike Bickle, Bob Jones, Paul Kane, but alongside them was Kevin Prosh.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Kevin had any actual recordings prior to this or not. I had a workshop tape from one of the early prophecy conferences that were happening at Anaheim Vineyard, which we'd actually been to a couple before we moved away, where Kevin was teaching on prophetic worship. And at the very end of the tape, he led about 20, 25 minutes of worship. Mm-hmm. So it's literally like the guitar's not, it's like he's like speaking, it's his speaker's mic.
Yeah. And
you can hear the guitar a little bit.
Yeah.
And
he's not plugged in,
and just singing and leading, like
spontaneous.
Well, I think there's some spontaneous stuff, but he's singing like King of Saints and maybe proto versions. I forget what was on there. Under the King. That's not his song, but he used to sing that forever. I know he sang King of Saints a very long time, and at the time, Vineyard leading worship in the Vineyard was very start to finish with the songs. There wasn't this extended prophetic spontaneous.
There's a way to do it.
Yeah. Well,
the song has the song has a form, then we do it like that.
Yeah. It was a very, very plain sort of form, but it wasn't quite so like do it like the record. It was more like this is how it works.
Yeah.
But this Kevin Prosh thing was right in the same vein, or right in the same time frame for me. Those two pieces that's probably where the switch flipped for me. It's like, I want to dedicate my life to this.
Yeah. So if I can ask you this, like, there's the Langley record and there's Prosh. Mm-hmm. Do you draw any arrows and go, well, maybe I picked up this from the Canadians, and maybe I picked up this from Prosh?
I would say that, yeah.
More than just permission.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say and this will make total sense, but the Canadians were very, very, very craft driven. and very focused. Like they were getting better at the craft of songwriting. And Kevin was just a prophetic, gifted.
Free.
Yeah. Yeah. So
isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
These two things happen at the same time, and they're like opposites of the same coin almost.
That's right. Well, and they definitely played a role in those two things together worked. They were like what I maybe the connection of the two is what I kind of needed at the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just for us as Vineyard people, like I would just like to say at this point in the story for everybody who's watching, this is actually really important. We hadn't planned this part of the conversation at all, but it occurs to me like in the Vineyard, we want to be people who are of craft. We want to be Brian Dirksen. We want to be Daphne Rademacher. We want to be Andy Park, right? Like let's write the song and edit it.
Spending more money on the records, like writing the best song we can write.
Yes.
Like growing and in our craft. Yes.
And like in the Vineyard, let's don't let go of the Kevin Prosh free thing, whatever that is. Yeah. That's really brilliant. Yeah, that's a thing.
It is a thing.
Yeah, okay, if you're a Vineyard worship leader, if you're a songwriter, pay attention to that.
That's right.
You're emotional, Casey.
I am.
Yeah, what's that about?
Well, I think it's collect myself.
Yeah, you're good.
I think there's just a measure of the Spirit of the Lord on that.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I feel it too. Like even just thinking, I mean, part of my story is so deeply connected to Vineyard Worship as well, and even a couple completely insane moments with Kevin Prosh, just where I didn't even know that was allowed.
Yeah,
I didn't even know a person could do that.
That's right.
And at the same time, the foundation is, we'll use Langley as a metaphor again, and that in the Vineyard these things can coexist.
That's right.
And actually, it's the best of us when they do.
I agree. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean that led me on all kinds of bumping around in the dark and writing and I, in a strange set of circumstances, I ended up being given a key to the best studio in Boise, which I'd sort of abandoned the dream of being Prince, I guess. In my Prince chairs.
Yeah, these are Prince chairs, by the way.
That's right. So the dream's still alive.
Yeah.
Kind of English worship leader, married to an Idaho gal, moved back to Boise and started this incredible space in Boise and started coming to the church, and gave a 19-year-old kid a key and free access to the studio. So I always look back on that as like, the Lord, as he takes things away from us and we move away even from, like I moved from, my plan prior to that probably would have been to move down to Hollywood or somewhere in LA and try to grind my way through the studio system. Instead, I give it all up and I moved to Boise, Idaho.
Nowheresville.
And I'm given a key to do whatever I want in this.
And I also think it's maybe important here to note too. I just called Boise Nowheresville. I mean, it's not. It's not. Yeah. It's not. It's a beautiful city, but like
it's not where you go to pursue a career in music.
Yeah, I also wonder though if part of the gift there is you're in a beautiful studio, but none of the external pressures of LA, none of the external pressures or even just the trappings of studio life in the big city.
Or even though, again, the modern worship thing was building itself, but even like a direct connection to maybe, although incredible things were happening in Anaheim and obviously places like Langley and Kevin Prosh in Kansas City at the time. But yeah, I think for me, it's like, there's one opportunity available in Boise for that to happen. It just happened to be for me. So that's the accidental work of the Spirit.
Yeah. So when did you write a song that got published for the Vineyard?
Well, I wrote a bunch of songs all the way back to my teenage. Probably the first worship song I wrote, I was probably 19, called "Bring the Breaking," which is a deep cut. It is actually published by Vineyard. First two songs I wrote, they weren't the first two songs published, but they were eventually published. "Bring the Breaking" is a song called Psalm 92. So that song, Psalm 92, it's good to give thanks. That actually continues. It's followed me for 30 years. So that it's very simple. It feels like it is an old Vineyard song. I think it got published in the late 90s, but the first song I ever had published, strangely enough, was a gospel song called Mercy, Mercy.
Was it published in the Vineyard? Or? Okay.
Which the Vineyard didn't really know what to do with at the time. But nonetheless, it was recorded by Mark McCoy, who's a great worship leader, not exactly a gospel singer, but hey.
That's right. Well, would this have been the initial entrance of gospel into the Vineyard?
Not
or there
exactly.
Other, like, little moments?
Yeah, there's other little moments. Well, one of the moments I think of is there's an Andy Park song, I think, that predates my song called How Priceless.
Yeah, I know that too.
Yeah, so that song, and then there, right about that time, although Mercy, Mercy was a couple years older, there was the intersection with Brownsville and Lindell Cooley, and that added a whole gospel flavor. Well, man, I can't leave out Mr. Terry Butler. So there definitely were some gospel edges.
There's some strands. Well, this is a conversation that you and I have pretty regularly because we work on songs for the Vineyard. That's part of what we do. But for the last 2 years, we've been talking about the Vineyard Buckets.
That's right.
Like, it's very unrefined language.
That's right.
But the kinds of things that tend to sort of emerge in the Vineyard without any strategy, and I don't even mean strategy in a bad way. I just mean like we're not making it happen, but based upon who's in the Vineyard and who God has given us, what kind of songs generally emerge. And
that's right.
One of the buckets is like this. We call it Vineyard Soul now. Tina, Joshua, Gino, you. Like there's this thing, but it's not. It didn't just start with Tina, Joshua, and Gino. No. There's been this strand that's in the Vineyard.
Yeah, Andy, Terry. There's definitely flavors of it in Scott Underwood's writing.
Yeah,
sure.
I think of
Kevin.
Scott, definitely. Yeah. But I think of Scott Underwood as being very blues influenced.
That's right.
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 And so I just think it's cool. I think we're seeing like a new version of it. And my goodness, with Tina and Joshua, they're such great singers, and they're emerging as such great writers.
That's right.
But I do think it's cool that the bucket, it's always been there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's part of our story.
That's right. That's right. We were, we were learning, and we're still learning. But
that's right. Yeah. Well, I just think that's beautiful. I love that it's not just something that gets made up all of a sudden, but it's kind of in our DNA.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, I guess I want to take a right-hand turn here, and I want to talk about songs, but I want to talk about songs specifically with you. And I guess what I'm thinking is this, Casey. You've been in Vineyard Worship for a long time. You've written a bunch of songs. I was actually thinking this morning, some people have songs in the catalog, but then there's some people who are a catalog. And so you're kind of the latter. You are a catalog. You are a song catalog. You've got a ton of songs in the Vineyard. But I think the thing that's interesting for me is you've been able to write songs across 4 decades.
That's right. Yeah.
That not only make it into the Vineyard catalog, but actually become things that people at lots of Vineyard churches sing. So that's weird. Like,
it is weird.
90s, aughts, teens, and then now we're in the 20s.
That's right.
And you're still doing this. Talk to me about that because okay, okay, so there's that. Okay, I'm just using you as kind of an archetype. There are other people in the Vineyard who've kind of got some of this going on too, who are prolific and are able to do this. But there's kind of 2 things that happen in the Vineyard. We have a few people who are prolific, archetype, multi-decade writers. And then the other thing that kind of happens in the Vineyard is a song could come from anywhere.
That's right.
Like think about all the people who have maybe one song in the catalog, but that really meant something.
That's right.
Okay, so we want all of it, we still do.
Right.
But I'm thinking, this is different. This is different, and what is it? Or just, I don't know. Talk to me about that.
Well, man, I hope the Vineyard is a place where we can keep bringing up the floor. I think historically everybody gets to play idea has been more about raising the floor, like bringing people in. And I think historically we haven't done a great job at raising our ceiling and letting people grow and letting people continue to develop in their gifting, especially in this music songwriting space, because we are, as Wimber said, he wanted ministers who do music, not musicians who minister. And the delineation would be like, our focus has always been on doing God's work.
Yeah.
Now, the thing I think where we lose the plot, and I know the Lord's done a course correction in my own life here, is some of us are called to more in the music space than and we're not called to move out of that. So,
growing up doesn't necessarily mean being a pastor.
Hanging up your guitar, planting a church.
And those are great things.
Yeah.
And we want those. But
sometimes that is the path, but it's not the path. There are other ways, and there are definitely people. Hopefully we can continue to create a space where people can grow into that. Well, I think of a few things when you bring that up. I think, you try to. Well, I just turned 50 this year. I said it on the podcast. I guess I got to own it now, but the idea of just staying young and staying fresh, like, two people come to mind straight away is Daniel Lanois, super producer, just turned 70, still doing incredible creative work. Paul McCartney's, co-writing, releasing records with the latest pop artists. I think it's uncomfortable to try to keep growing. It's uncomfortable to learn from people younger than you.
Yeah.
I used to be the youngest person in the room. Now I'm becoming the oldest person in the room. They're similar gears, but they have their own unique challenges as well. So
yeah. Well, I guess on the songwriting side, it's just interesting to me, not only that you have kept writing, but there is a difference. There's something similar in your songs through the decades, but there is a difference. Like, and you were using words like growth or, increasing the ceiling,
right?
All of that. And I think I hear that in you.
Right.
And I don't know if you had somebody tell you, okay, so you have permission, or if you just felt it internally, or if you felt it from the Lord, or if you just, you were just like, this is what I do, so I have hunger for it.
Right.
But I think that's interesting, because sometimes a musician or a writer can have a thing, and then they do their thing, and it's really powerful in a moment, but then it doesn't translate to the next decade, or to the next season.
Right. Well, I think there's certainly something to, like, I have schizophrenic and eclectic tastes. So there's and maybe enough musical ability to try to explore those tastes. So there's that piece. And then I think I've realized as I've looked back on my life in music and my life in ministry is like I haven't done the artist thing very well. Like I've been in other lanes, which is funny for me to say that, but I've been behind the glass more than I've been in front of the glass.
Well, we were going to talk about that in a minute. Yeah. So we can just go into that.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a songwriter. You make records.
That's right.
For yourself. But in the Vineyard, you've mostly helped other people make records.
Well, which is funny for me to kind of look back and sort of realize it, because I lead worship almost every week, pretty much every week. So I've been on stage a lot, and I've been I've my voice is heard a lot. But to actually think like, oh, I haven't really done, like, the last time I personally released a record was 2012.
Yeah.
Like my early Vineyard life, I did a lot more than I do now, and it's almost accidental. I do think that is, I think we're following our own threads, but I do think it is baked into our Vineyard story, our Vineyard culture. I think that's part of the, giving it away. I don't think giving it away means, I think sometimes it could mean you don't participate anymore. But for me, it's just meant I sit in a different seat,
Yeah.
It could be the co-writer seat, it could be the producer seat, it could be the, label seat, or whatever hat I'm wearing at the time.
I also wonder though, if being willing to sit in another seat, or being willing to help someone else with their song or their project, or, especially some of what you've been doing for the last couple of years, which is like song doctor, finishing songs, helping people just, fix things and shine it a little bit. I wonder if all of that doesn't help for lack of a better phrase, keep you young. You're staying in contact with people. And so, okay, maybe I've switched seats, but gosh, and I really hate this word, I'm relevant,
Yeah, right.
Not that that's the ultimate goal, but I do see that in like the work you're doing, it's like, wow, you're not just helping this person.
That's right.
But then there's something that's coming back to you.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's kind of no matter where you are in your life or journey, I think there's certainly things to be learned. And I think I generally try to stay curious with things, and I'm just curious about all kinds of things. So, I think, and then as time has gone on, it's there's shelf lives, there's certainly career shelf lives, but in the worship seat, and no one's going to tell you what the shelf life is. I mean, hopefully the Lord leads us in these things, or we have some self-awareness. But there's, the shelf life of a worship leader, stage worship leader, or a worship artist, or whatever whatever words we want to put on this, it's limited, So I think over time you think, well, I'm called to this thing. What does that look like? I think part of it is it's a God-directed journey that I've been on, but it's gifting and calling, and it's opportunities, walking through certain doors. But I think, as you get older, you realize, if I'm going to stay relevant, if I'm going to stay faithful to what I feel like the call is, it's going to cost me something again. It's going to cost me, I need to grow. I need to figure out what chords are being used right now. I need to figure out what melody choices are being used right now. How does lo-fi work? How do these different lo-fi coming out this Friday, although it was a couple of weeks ago now.
Yeah, that's right.
But like that's super fun work for me, is getting into someone else's gifting and helping them bring that to life, but also getting into the language and the style of different genres of music, and what makes certain things tick, and what makes it sound legitimate, and what works, what doesn't work.
Well, it also occurs to me, not only have you written songs that matter across 4 decades, but it also occurs to me that, and we've kind of hinted in on this as well, but that you're a musician who has, we'll just call it range. Maybe home base is soul, R&B, whatever that is, right. Prince,
right?
Right. Prince pop. Maybe that's home base, but I've seen you play electric guitar in mega church worship, or stadium worship, whatever that is. You and I are still looking for the right.
That's right.
For the right word on that.
The non-offensive term.
Yeah, or just like whatever, straight down the middle.
Yeah. What most people are playing.
Worship rock.
Yeah.
Right. Like you play electric guitar, and you've got your pedal board, and it's spot on. I've seen you grab an acoustic guitar and play with John Barnett and Chris Lizotte and whatever that Americana thing is.
Right.
You have range. So I don't know, maybe it would be great for you to talk a little bit about being a musician who doesn't get like stuck in one tiny little box.
Right. Well, there's certainly a lot of variances genre to genre, but there's also not.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, say, let's talk about R&B gospel and the Americana stuff. There is so many resonant notes in those. They come from a very similar musical home. So, so those worlds aren't that far apart, and we're still using a Western 12-note scale. Like the
1-4-5.
Yeah,
give me the 1-4-5.
Yeah, one of my running jokes with worship bands who want chord sheets is like, it's just worship music.
Come on.
It's pop music, worship, fill in the blank. It's and actually, I love complex music. In fact, we're about to release some of the most gospel things we've ever done in a month or two. That will push some limits when it comes to complexity, but my favorite sorts of songs to lead much of the time are songs that don't do much. They're songs that live in I like songs that I like songs that the progression never changes. If you can write a song that does that, it's the easiest song to teach to a band. It's the easiest song to lead in a small group. And they make great worship songs. They make great pop songs. They don't have to live in that space. And I certainly love things that go far afield one way or the other. But again, I think the nuances of genre it does matter. Those things do matter, whether a lot of times they feel like they're tone choices and instrumental choices or rhythmic choices than they are literally the bones of music, like chords and structure like that. So,
well, even when you were talking about songs that don't go anywhere, or songs that are just a chord progression over and over, the fun part about a song like that is that you can push it somewhere.
That's right.
And it doesn't have to be the same thing every time. And
that's right.
Maybe we could lean it one direction, or depending on who's in our band and who's singing, we could turn it another direction.
Right. Well, I think of a song like Sam Lane's "Saved." It's like a chord and a half.
It's a chord and a half, yeah.
Two chords.
And like your first decision with that song when you're teaching it to the band is, are we going to play the 4?
Yeah,
or not?
Just stay on the 1.
Let's just pedal the 1.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, again, we can kind of go different. But again, the nuances of genre are I think they're a little bit found in the dressings around those sorts of things. So I think Range starts with, I think it starts with core theory stuff.
Yeah.
But I think it also comes with being curious and being willing to invest yourself in maybe genres you don't particularly care for. It might be the start of it. But I think it's hard. I think it's hard if you press too far into it to find music that you just generally dislike for some reason,
Yeah. Well, it also occurs to me, just whether or not you like the genre or not, playing with musicians you do like,
right,
is a great connection point. You know, I'll never forget. This was super funny. This was at one of our worship retreats several years ago in North Carolina. You may have been there too, but we've talked about John Barnett a few times. I think John was leading that night, and Joshua played drums for him. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It was like the oddest pairing, but then worship was amazing that night.
Right.
And it's like these two worlds kind of came together. And I know that even I'm not a musician who has range, but I know that my interest, because you used that word a moment ago, my interest has grown as my friendships with musicians and writers who do live in different spaces has grown.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that makes me think about, just the role. It's certainly the role of a producer. I guess you could kind of like overlay this over lots of it could move out of the musical space too, but the role of a producer and the role of a side player is to serve the leader. I'll use the word artist. Serve the artist and serve the song. So some of that, the genre thing, we have the blessing in the Vineyard with having, you mentioned John Barnett. We were talking about John a lot.
Yeah.
People have, Joshua Miller, Tina Cologne Williams, John Barnett, Kyle Howard, Annabeth Morgan, Tim Brown, the people that live in different lanes. And so it's such an honor and it's super fun to be able to lean into what makes that person shine. Maybe stretch them, but not force them into your preferences or, how can I play B3 behind John Barnett in a way that it sounds like it should sound,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, back to something you said a moment ago, the space between certain gospel or soul tones or songs and Americana is sometimes closer than we think. Like nothing brings it together more than an organ.
Well, yes,
right? Like the common denominator, like the one instrument you can play in all the places,
right,
is the Hammond.
If you throw too many of those extra passing chords in there, you'll get a stink eye from John, though.
Yeah, he's not going to have it. Well, Casey, maybe just a couple more questions before we wrap. You are working with us at Vineyard Worship, and your main thing is song development and production. If we were to use insider language, A&R, artist development, like writing songs and making things happen. Anything you want to say just to the vineyard writers?
Yeah.
Because it feels like we have this new, kind of this new crop. It feels like there's just new people writing.
Right. Well, kind of back to something I said earlier, I think we want to raise our ceiling. We want to raise the floor, raise the ceiling. So I want our writers I want them to pursue the depths of their writing gift as far and wide as they can. You know, even outside the worship space. I've been doing a fair amount of that in recent years, just expanding what it means to write, to write songs in general. I think if we get too caught in our little boxes, I think we lose some range at the end of the day. So I think if we can expand our horizons about what it means to develop as a songwriter or even a singer, you know, even our musical range. I think and I just think we're in an interesting time in music where, you know, Vineyard Worship has limited resources, and we have, you know, we've ratcheted that down. We're expanding a little bit this year, but we basically do monthly singles. So that means we skip January, skip December. That means you count the singles. That's 10. And
we're going to share 2 or 3 with the Brits.
Yeah, so that's a pretty narrow funnel. So if our writers and our local churches, worship teams, worship ministries, and I'll use the artist word again, you know, people that are called to do this music thing at a more developed level. If you feel like you need permission, you have permission. We want our Vineyard creative community to continue to be as vibrant and alive as it always has been. But just know from the Vineyard, you know, and I know we've talked a lot about this. Just know from us who are sitting in the Vineyard worship seats here, you know, we're not trying to control what you're doing. In fact, it's very much the opposite. We're not trying to be the only funnel of what is Vineyard or songs that come out of legitimate, even Vineyard songs that are Vineyard, quote unquote, Vineyard worship songs. So I would say we need to be free to write and to grow. Otherwise, I think we're going to collapse in. I don't think it's going to happen. So
I think that's it. And
so you have permission.
Yeah, I love that. And I just want to reflect maybe back to something you were saying earlier, like the idea of Kevin Prosh and Langley. And even, you know, when the Vineyard was I'm using air quotes here for those who are just listening to the audio version, the Vineyard was at the height of its powers.
That's right.
You know, musical influence and in the worship space or whatever. Right. There were these places. It wasn't just that the Vineyard was located in Anaheim.
Right.
There's Anaheim, there's Langley, there's KC. There's a little bit later definitely stuff happening in England.
That's right.
And you just have this. There's lots of places.
That's right.
And I'm just wondering if we're not about to re-enter a space where there are, I guess the word that's coming to me now, are greenhouses.
Yeah.
There's greenhouses of worship, where things are growing, and you know the things that are happening in a greenhouse, they can be transplanted.
That's right.
You know, and I'm just wondering if maybe that we're not heading toward a moment like that again.
Yeah, our best work as a movement starts very local. It starts from people investing in their own writing gifts. It starts from people trying to express their hearts and the heart of the Lord for their local congregations. You know, most times, the big global songs have a very local story.
Yeah.
They come from somewhere. They don't come from Vineyard Worship or, you know, some top-down thing. They come from real people walking out real life. You know, Holy and Anointed One, you know, John Barnett, we talked about John a lot here. You know, John comes home from, you know, a day in the sewers, you know, he worked for the water department and picks up his guitar and writes Holy and Anointed One. That's a beautiful picture of the work we're actually doing here, and where our songs come from.
Amen. That's beautiful. Well, Casey, thanks for sharing your story, and just thanks for doing the things you do.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you.
Man. Well, hey, let's end this podcast, but let's end it the way we end all of them on season 3. And you're the producer, so you know.
Yeah, I know it's coming.
Yeah.
I didn't actually think about it.
Oh, man, this is intense.
See where we go, yeah.
One thing I know is...
And
it doesn't even have to be profound.
Yeah.
Mr. Barbecue is good. There's a Korean joint around the corner here.
Yeah, thank you for letting me off the hook there.
Yeah.
One thing I know is God knows better than we do.
Amen. Amen. That's a great way to end it. All right, Casey. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Shout out, everybody. Peace.